12 years ago, 14-year-old Marcus Bell kissed his mom goodbye and jogged off toward the high school football field for team tryout. She never came back. No one saw him leave, no body was found, and every search turned up empty. The town grieved, moved on, and the field stayed silent until one foggy September afternoon when a referee's cleat snagged something strange buried beneath the 40-yard line. What he pulled out wasn't a rock or a root. It was a boy's tattered jersey, Marcus's, still stained with blood. And beneath that, something that would unravel everything the town thought it knew. The sun beat down on the practice field behind Fairhaven High, casting long shadows from the goalposts onto the freshly chalked lines. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and sweat, whistles piercing the afternoon heat like sharp needles of sound. It was the second day of freshman football tryouts, and Jake Morrow, 14, quiet, lanky, with dark, shaggy hair and a grin that came easier with animals than people, was there early, like always. He waved goodbye to his mother at the drop-off loop, shouldered his gym bag, and disappeared behind the chain-link fence. Rachel Morrow watched until the gate clanged shut behind him, then checked the time. 3:41 p.m. She drove off slowly, not knowing that would be the last time she saw her son. An hour later, as drills began winding down, Jake's absence wasn't even noticed. Coach Everett Dean ran tight rotations and demanded order. Players came and went across the field, some benched for underperforming, others running extra laps for mouthing off. It wasn't until roll call for final sprints that someone asked, "Where's Morrow?" Nobody had seen him. Not in the locker room, not on the sidelines, not among the group, doing passing drills. "He was here earlier," said another boy, squinting toward the parking lot. But his cleats were still at the gate, perfectly lined up like they always were, toe to fence, laces tucked in. That was Jake's habit, a little ritual before hitting the turf. But there were no footprints in the dirt leading away from them, and no one remembered him leaving. By dusk, the school was on alert. Principal Hensley called in the custodians to check every hallway, every bathroom, even the roof. The field lights stayed on long after the sun went down. Parents started arriving early, some looking for their own kids, others pulled by the whisper of something wrong. By 8:15, the police were there. Rachel was back on campus, panic blooming beneath her ribs like a wildfire. She walked the perimeter with a flashlight in one hand and Jake's cleats in the other. They still smelled faintly of grass and leather. Security footage showed Jake entering the field. But he never came out. That night, Fairhaven went still. By morning, search teams would be combing the woods behind the school. Helicopters would hover over cornfields, and whispers sharp, cruel things would begin to echo through town. Jake ran away, Jake was taken, Jake was dead. But no one knew. Not yet. The morning after Jake vanished, the town of Fairhaven woke to a storm of sirens, searchlights, and the slow, creeping dread that seeps into bones when a child goes missing. Rachel Morrow hadn't slept. Her eyes were raw, her voice hollow from shouting her son's name into the woods behind the school. Thomas, usually quiet and reserved, stood rigid near the bleachers, jaw clenched, as though keeping his composure would somehow hold the world together. The police set up a base in the school gym. Folding tables stacked with maps and radios were flanked by officers, volunteers, and neighbors bearing flashlights, water bottles, and printed flyers already curling at the edges. Jake's face smiled up from every one of them. Same photo from last year's science fair, dimples, shaggy hair, braces still fresh. The initial search was aggressive. Dogs swept the field and surrounding forest within hours. Aerial drones buzzed above, their mechanical whirring a stark contrast to the hush of hopeful silence below. Divers combed the retention pond behind the visitors' parking lot, slipping beneath its muddy surface, while Rachel stood at the edge, fists clenched so tightly her nails cut into her palms. For the first 3 days, the community surged. Hundreds came, local businesses shut down, offering manpower and meals. Kids skipped school to post flyers. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone wanted to believe Jake had just wandered off, that he'd emerged dirty, hungry, but alive. But by the end of the week, that belief began to sour. The sheriff's daily briefings got shorter. The volunteers thinned out, speculation crept in. Maybe Jake wasn't taken. Maybe he didn't want to be found. Rachel refused to rest. She pored through maps, redrew search grids, barked instructions to volunteers like a field commander. Thomas took the night shifts walking wooded trails with a flashlight, and the dog leash Jake had always left by the door. He never spoke during those walks, not even to Rachel when he returned in the cold hours before dawn. On the 10th day, the school district announced the football program would be suspended indefinitely. No more tryouts, no more games. The field would be closed until further notice. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it felt like one. The goalposts came down quietly, at dusk, while Rachel stood watching from the parking lot. She didn't cry. She just stared at the empty field, her son's absence louder than the silence that now hung over every inch of that turf. And still, no trace of Jake. Not a shoe, not a note. Just the cleats at the gate. 12 years is a long time for a field to forget, but Fairhaven's football turf never really did. Grass grew wild where lines used to be drawn. Rust spread along the bleachers like a slow disease. Rainwater pooled in the old locker room, soaking forgotten jerseys and ghosting the tiles with mildew. Yet every fall, like clockwork, someone would find the gate unlatched, the cleats still sitting by the fencer right where Jake Morrow left them. No one claimed to move them, no one dared throw them away. Kids whispered it was haunted. That sometimes, late at night, you could hear the sharp blow of a whistle, even though the field had been silent for over a decade. One senior swore he saw movement on the 50-yard line last Halloween, just a flicker, like someone running a route. Another claimed she heard crying from the bleachers on her way home from band practice. Jake, they said, in the hush between classes. He's still out there. He never left. Rachel Morrow never left either. The town had long since returned to its rhythm spep rallies now held in the gym. The annual bonfire moved to a church parking lot, but Rachel's world remained centered on that field. She walked its edge every morning before sunrise, coat zipped up tight, eyes scanning the grass as if some hidden truth might finally surface. Every evening she left fresh flowers by the gate, white hydrangeas in summer, pine boughs in winter. No one knew where she got them. It didn't matter. The house she and Thomas had once shared sat like a mausoleum on the edge of downtown. Thomas moved out 2 years after Jake vanished, needing space, needing quiet, needing something Rachel could no longer give. They spoke occasionally, voices brittle, strained by too many years of saying everything and still not knowing anything, but Rachel stayed. Her home became a shrine, Jake's room untouched, his backpack still by the door, his favorite cereal always stocked in the pantry. People called her obsessed, broken. Some pitied her, others avoided her altogether. But she didn't care. To Rachel, giving up meant admitting Jake was dead, and if he was dead, it meant someone killed him, someone she might pass in the grocery store, someone who might wave at her from a stoplight. She couldn't bear it. So she held on to her routines, her rituals, her belief that Jake was out there waiting. Some nights, she swore she could still hear his voice echoing across the field. "Mom, over here!" She'd turn toward the sound, heart in her throat. But there was never anyone there. The first thing Glenn Fisher noticed when he stepped onto the field was how much smaller it looked. The goalposts were new, gleaming in the sun like teeth. Fresh turf stretched in perfect green lines beneath his feet, and the bleachers had been power-washed and repainted, their rusted ghosts scrubbed away. But none of it could hide what this place used to be. 12 years, he muttered, half to himself, half to the crisp autumn air. 12 damn seasons. He adjusted the collar of his black and white striped jersey and blew into his whistle, more out of habit than necessity. Glenn hadn't refereed a high school game in over a decade since the shutdown, not since Jake Morrow vanished. The town might have paved over the past, but he felt it pressing up through the ground like bones under shallow soil. He had been a junior when Jake disappeared, tight end, number 89. He remembered that last practice too clearly, the humidity, the heat, the smell of Gatorade and grass. He remembered seeing Jake by the water cooler, helmet under his arm, eyes wide like he was always bracing for something. Glenn never spoke to him that day. He'd told himself it was because they didn't run in the same circles. He told himself a lot of things. Now, in 2025, football had returned to Fairhaven. A new coach, a new roster, a new generation of kids with clean jerseys and big dreams. But the shadow of Jake Morrow stretched the length of the field, even if they didn't say his name out loud. Everyone knew why the program had been shut down. Everyone knew who still left flowers at the gate. Glenn scanned the stands. Parents, students, cheerleaders trying their best to bring back a tradition half the town had buried. Near the back, sitting alone with a thermos of coffee clutched tight in her hands, was Rachel Morrow. She didn't clap, didn't cheer, just watched with eyes like stone. The teams took the field, the crowd quieted. Glenn stepped forward, raised his whistle to his lips and stopped. Right in front of the goalpost, at the edge of the end zone, was a patch of turf that didn't match the rest. It was subtle, maybe an oversight, maybe a last-minute repair. But it was soft. Too soft. He made a mental note to check it after the game. For now, he blew the whistle, the shrill sound slicing through 12 years of silence. Football had returned to Fairhaven. But the past hadn't gone anywhere. Halftime came like a breath between held note cheerleaders jogging out, water bottles passed from sweaty hands, coaches barking in huddles, the band fumbling through a brass-heavy rendition of the fight song. Glenn Fisher paced the end zone, checking markers and scanning the field, trying to distract himself from the strange pull of memory that hadn't let up since the whistle blew. Then his foot sank. Just slightly. Enough to catch his balance and stumble forward, one arm flailing out to right himself. He looked down. The turf there wasn't torn, wasn't visibly different from the rest. But it gave under his weight like fresh earth, springy, damp, wrong. He crouched, pressed his palm flat. The ground bowed beneath it. Probably waterlogged, he muttered, standing quickly, brushing his hands against his pants, but the unease didn't leave. He checked for eyes on him, saw none. The players were busy, the crowd loud, and Rachel Morrow, ever constant, sat unmoving in the same seat as before, her eyes fixed on the field but seeing something else entirely. The second half played out in a blur. Penalties, touchdowns, missed kicks, all of it background noise to the thought worming through Glenn's brain. That patch of turf, that softness, that space just in front of where the old goalpost used to stand, where Jake Morrow's cleats were found 12 years ago. By the time the game ended and the field began to clear, Glenn had made up his mind. He returned well after sunset. The school lights were off, the parking lot empty. He parked around the block, walked the rest of the way, hoodie pulled up against the cold. In his trunk he carried a folding shovel, the kind campers use. He didn't question why he brought it. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. The silence of the field was suffocating at night. Without the roar of the crowd, without the distraction of motion, everything seemed still. Glenn walked slowly, the thud of his boots too loud in his own ears. When he reached the end zone, he dropped to his knees and touched the spot again. Soft, just like before. He unfolded the shovel and pressed it into the turf. The blade slid in with disturbing ease, like the ground had been waiting. He dug. Each scoop released a damp, earthy smell. Glenn kept going, hands trembling slightly, breath fogging in front of him. Then the shovel hit something solid. Not a root, not rock. Something man-made. He froze. Then dug faster. The metal edge of the shovel struck something with a muted clunk, hollow and unnatural beneath layers of damp soil. Glenn's breath hitched. He knelt, pushing loose dirt aside with his hands now, fingers trembling as he uncovered a corner of fabric mud caked, frayed, and sunken into the earth like it had been trying to vanish. He paused. His heart was pounding in his chest, a deep, irregular drumbeat that drowned out the sounds of the night. The floodlights were off. The bleachers stood silent and skeletal behind him. No cars. No witnesses. Just him, the field, and the soft churn of decades-old dirt giving up its secrets. He tugged gently, and the fabric gave way with a wet rip, revealing a collapsed duffel bag. It had once been dark green, but now it was gray and black with decay. The zipper crumbled when he touched it, snapping beneath his fingers like dry twigs. Inside, the smell hit him, first old rot, mildew, something faintly metallic, not fresh, not strong, but unmistakably wrong. He found a whistle first, still looped through a cracked leather lanyard, its metal tarnished and green at the seams. Glenn stared at it. The mouthpiece was warped, as if it had been chewed or crushed. He set it aside carefully, onto the folded edge of his jacket. Next came a phone, or what was left of one. The screen was spiderwebbed, the casing bent in on itself like it had been stomped or driven over. Glenn turned it over in his hands, light from his headlamp catching on the shattered glass. The sticker on the back had faded, but he could still make out the brand same model Jake Morrow had the year he vanished. The same kind Glenn remembered seeing in his hands during lunch, watching him scroll through playlists and football clips. His fingers brushed something paper-thin near the bottom of the bag. It stuck slightly as he lifted it, free a folded note, stained with something dark and rust-colored, the paper stiff and brittle. It tore at one corner, and Glenn felt the crackle of old blood beneath his fingertips. He unfolded it slowly, as though whatever it contained might shatter under light. 3 words. Written in blocky, uneven letters, the ink darker in some places, faded in others. Coach knows. Glenn stared at the words until the wind picked up, rustling the trees beyond the field. Then he folded the note, slipped it into his pocket, and looked back toward the school. He wasn't sure what terrified him more, that the bag had been buried here all this time, or that someone knew it would be found. The news broke before dawn. Someone had found something at the field. That was all it took. Own whispered call from a janitor who lived near the school, one photo snapped by a curious teenager who saw the squad car parked by the old goalpost. By the time the sun rose over Fairhaven, the town was buzzing. Rachel Morrow heard about it from the gas station clerk. She was halfway through her morning coffee, standing in line behind a man buying scratch tickets, when she heard the words that stopped her heart. They found a bag. At the field. Cops were there last night. She left the coffee on the counter and ran. By the time she got there, the field was already cordoned off with yellow tape, the kind that flutters in the wind like warning flags. Officers milled around the end zone. The grass was torn in a small rectangular patch, earth turned over like an open wound. A detective stood with his hands on his hips, staring down at a black evidence bag lying beside a sealed plastic container. Rachel didn't ask permission. She ducked beneath the tape before anyone could stop her. Her boots sank into the soft ground as she walked toward the officers. The wind tugged at the hem of her coat, but she didn't feel the cold. The detective turned. He opened his mouth to object, saw her face, and closed it again. "This is yours," he said quietly. He handed her the bag. It was sealed. The plastic fogged with condensation from the morning air, but through it she saw what lay inside. A duffel bag, its seams rotted, the leather strap cracked. Her breath hitched as her eyes caught the glint of a whistle, familiar, scuffed, the same one she had bought Jake the summer before high school. And then she saw the phone. Crushed, silent, still holding what might have been the last things her son ever said. Rachel dropped to her knees in the grass. The bag crinkled in her hands as she held it like something sacred. Her face twisted, not in grief, not just in pain, but something deeper. Recognition. Confirmation. The terrible weight of almost knowing. "I packed this for him," she whispered. "That morning. He forgot his cleats and ran back for them, but I zipped this up myself." No one moved. No one spoke. Rachel knelt there in the dirt, cradling the evidence like a child, like it might still be warm. The wound that had scarred over, the silence that had swallowed years, had been torn open again, and this time it was bleeding. They found Coach Everett Dean in a pale green recliner, the kind that made a soft hiss when you leaned back too far. His house smelled like old books and powdered soup mix, the curtains drawn against the sun, a football game humming low on the television muted, as if the voices of younger players were too much for him now. He wore a faded Fairhaven high jacket, the logo stitched into the chest with a threadbare pride. When he saw the detectives at his door, he didn't seem surprised. He just turned down the volume and said, It's about the Morrow boy, isn't it? He'd been retired 10 years. Moved out of town, then quietly returned, settling into this rental on the edge of Maple Road, where no one really looked twice. He said he still thought about Jake. Thought about the day the boy vanished. But his story hadn't changed since the first time he gave it. Kid never made it to the field, Dean said, voice dry as old paper. Saw him come through the gate, but something must have spooked him. He turned around before warm-ups. I figured he quit. The detective took notes but didn't look up. Didn't mention that in the original statement. Dean blinked. Thought I did. He hadn't. In his official report from 12 years ago, Dean had said Jake attended the full warm-up, did passing drills, and was last seen stretching with the group before disappearing from the locker room. Now suddenly, Jake hadn't even stayed? Inconsistencies started to bloom like oil on water. The attendance sheet from that day still on file in the district's dusty storage had Jake's name marked as present. His cleats were found inside the gate, yes, but not beyond the field. The cameras had gaps 12 minutes missing from the west side corridor that led to the equipment shed. Dean swore he never touched those cameras. That's a tech guy thing, he said, waving the question away. I just coached ball. But when asked who held the keys to the shed, the ones the janitor said always stayed on Dean's lanyard, his answer wavered. Probably me, sure, but I didn't use it that day. Yet someone had. Fresh shoe prints had been found behind the shed, back then never matched. And now? The bag buried under the goalpost, the note that said, Coach knows. Dean's eyes flickered when they mentioned it. He rubbed his jaw, stared past the TV, and muttered something about the media twisting everything again. But the silence that followed wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the kind that comes from remembering too much and saying too little. The locker room hadn't changed much. New paint maybe, and the scent of antiseptic instead of sweat and dust, but the benches were still too narrow, the vents still rattled when the heat kicked on, and the echoes still hung around like ghosts refusing to leave. Glenn stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping inside. 12 years ago he'd sat right there, third bench from the left, lacing up his cleats, grumbling about drills. Jake had sat 2 rows down, by the sink with the broken faucet. Quiet, awkward. The kind of kid who smiled when spoken to but rarely started the conversation. Glenn didn't know him well. Nobody really did. Now he was back here, asking questions about a boy everyone had tried to forget. He reached out to a few old teammates. Most didn't answer. Some gave short texts, polite and hollow. Man, that was so sad. Hope they find something. But 2 showed up. Nate Godfrey and Tyler Shea. Both former linemen. Both had stuck around Fairhaven, working at the local hardware store and coaching youth leagues. They came out of obligation or maybe curiosity. They sat with Glenn in the locker room, hands resting on their knees like old habits die slow. You remember that tryout? Glenn asked. Nate nodded. Can't forget it. Whole town lost its mind after. Tyler leaned back, arms crossed. I remember Jake. Kinda twitchy kid. He was nervous. Kept looking at Coach like he was waiting for something. Glenn hesitated. Did either of you see him argue with Coach Dean? The silence that followed wasn't long, but it was telling. I did, Nate said finally. Didn't seem like a big deal back then. Jake was supposed to stay after for extra drills or something. Coach told him to run a route, and Jake pushed back. Said he'd already done enough. I remember thinking, man, that's not gonna end well. Coach get mad? Glenn asked. Didn't yell, Nate said, but his face went real still. You know that look he had when he was pissed? Not shouting, just cold. Tyler shifted in his seat, uneasy. I wasn't there for that, he said, but I was in the shower when I heard something weird coming from outside, like crying, real soft, coming from the shed. Glenn looked up sharply. You sure? Tyler nodded, his voice lower now. I thought maybe someone twisted an ankle or Coach was giving some kid a speech, but I don't know. It didn't sound like a coach chewing somebody out. It sounded like someone scared. He swallowed hard. I should have checked. No one spoke after that. The room was quiet again, and not in the peaceful way. In the kind of quiet that feels like it's listening. Rachel showed up at the school board office unannounced, shoulders squared beneath a worn brown coat, her hair tied back in a tight knot that dared anyone to question her presence. She carried a folder clutched to her chest copies of police reports, screenshots from old emails, a grainy printout of the camera layout from Fairhaven High, dated September 2013. She didn't wait in the lobby. She walked straight past the receptionist and into the superintendent's office like it was hers by right. They remembered her. Of course they did. 12 years ago she had stood in the same spot, pleading for answers, demanding footage, pressing her palms flat on the polished desk as tears ran down her face. The superintendent back then had been a man named Lowell, known for his mustache and his ability to say nothing for long stretches of time. He had retired. The woman sitting there now, Dr. Marianne Becker, looked up from her laptop, startled. "I need to see the tapes," Rachel said. Dr. Becker set down her pen. "Mrs. Morrow." "I'm not asking," Rachel cut in. "I'm not here for platitudes, or sympathy, or excuses. I want the tapes, all of them." Becker blinked. "You mean from the day Jake disappeared?" Rachel nodded once. "Yes, every camera angle, inside and out." There was a pause. Becker folded her hands, polite and guarded. "Those tapes were reviewed during the investigation." "Not all of them," Rachel snapped. She slapped the printout onto the desk. "These 3 West Hall locker corridor, equipment shed never showed up in the evidence file. Not then, not now. Why?" Becker glanced at the diagram. Her eyes flicked to a note in the margin. "Footage not available, system error?" "We were told," she began carefully, "that some of the data was lost. There was a power surge the week after." Rachel leaned in. "Don't insult me. That footage was on a secure loop. It auto-saved to external servers. I spoke to the IT director last week. He said at least 2 feeds were intact at the time. And yet, they never made it to police." Silence. Becker shifted in her chair. If tapes were omitted, it wasn't done maliciously. Things were chaotic. People made mistakes. Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper. "My son didn't disappear because of a mistake." She stared at Becker for a long moment, then turned and walked out, leaving the folder on the desk like a planted flag. Behind her, the office felt suddenly colder. And Dr. Becker, for the first time since taking the job, locked her door. The evidence lab was housed in a squat beige building just off the interstate, the kind of place you wouldn't look at twice if you didn't know what it held. Inside, under humming fluorescence and rows of locked drawers, the past was dissected fiber by fiber, smudge by smudge. That morning, Glenn sat across from a forensic analyst named Halverson, a pale man with tired eyes and gloves that never seemed to come off. The whistle, the phone, the blood-stained note, they were all lined up neatly on the table, each encased in its own clear evidence pouch. Glenn could feel their weight even through the plastic. "It's his," Halverson said, tapping the note. "The writing. We compared it to his school assignments, yearbook messages, old essays pulled from district archives. No doubt, Jake Morrow wrote this." Glenn leaned in. "In blood?" Halverson nodded. "Type O positive, same as Jake's medical records." Glenn swallowed. "So he was alive, wherever he was, long enough to write it." There was a pause. The air felt thick. "We also pulled partial prints off the whistle," Halverson continued. "Underneath the lanyard clasp, worn but not erased." He picked up a sheet and slid it across the table. "Match came back. Leo Maddox." Glenn stared at the name. Maddox, the assistant coach. People barely mentioned him anymore. He disappeared from Fairhaven 2 weeks after Jake vanished, citing family reasons and a need to step away from coaching. No one pushed back. Dean said he'd been shaken by the incident, that he couldn't handle the media. He left town quietly and was never seen again. Until now. Glenn's hands curled into fists against his knees. "You think Maddox was the one who buried the bag?" he asked. Halverson shrugged. "We can't know that yet. but the whistle's chain was looped twice, like someone meant to hide it, not lose it, and the prints are old years old. No signs of contamination or recent handling. He touched it around the time Jake went missing, that much is clear. Glenn felt a chill settle in his chest. All these years, the town had looked at Dean, whispered about mistakes, cover-ups, bad leadership. But Leo Maddox had vanished into the wind, name fading like chalk on a rain-washed sidewalk. And now his fingerprint had reappeared, pressed into a whistle Jake had last worn. Right before he was silenced. The Maddox file had collected dust for over a decade. It was buried deep in the district's administrative archivia slim manila folder, with creases worn smooth from years of handling, and then, curiously, not handling at all. Glenn found it with the help of a clerk who remembered Coach Maddox as a guy who wasn't very coach-like, too polished, too rehearsed. The kind of man who wore collared shirts to practice and called plays like he was auditioning for a higher league. Maddox had left town just 13 days after Jake Morrow vanished. No press conference, no goodbye, no official explanation to the parents or students. He simply stopped showing up. One Monday, his desk was still cluttered with playbooks and a half-drunk cup of gas station coffee. By Wednesday, it was clean scrubbed of personality, scrubbed of memory. By Friday, a sub was in his place, and no one spoke his name in the teacher's lounge again. But inside that folder, stapled to a routine HR exit document, was a note that should have never gone unnoticed. Confidential settlement paid to family of student-athlete. Incident undisclosed. Per agreement, neither party shall discuss details. Terms not to be released without court order. The date? 2 weeks before Jake disappeared. Glenn stared at it until the numbers blurred. There was no name listed. Just student-athlete. No accusation, no context. Just a payout and a silence, signed off by the district's legal counsel and approved by the same superintendent who had shaken Rachel's hand at a candlelight vigil the week after her son vanished. He took the paper to Rachel that evening. She read it in the dying light of her living room, the walls still hung with framed photos of Jake laughing in the pool, arms wrapped around a shaggy golden retriever, grinning with a missing front tooth. "They paid someone to be quiet," she said flatly. Glenn nodded. "And they kept it out of the investigation." Rachel looked up slowly, her face unreadable. And Maddox walked away. It wasn't anger in her voice. It wasn't shock. It was something colder, older. A grief so familiar, it had curdled into steel. She folded the paper carefully and placed it back on the table like evidence in a courtroom. Her fingers lingered on the edge. "We were never supposed to see this," she whispered. And outside, the wind rose over Fairhaven, the sound of leaves dragging across pavement like the past refusing to stay buried. The lock on the equipment shed was rusted through, its hinge eaten by time and neglect. It groaned softly as Rachel jimmied it with a flathead screwdriver tucked into her coat sleeve. The door creaked open on a whimper of hinges, revealing a room that hadn't been touched in years, maybe longer. Dust hung in the air like ash. The smell was sharp and metallic, the lingering scent of sweat-soaked pads and old turf paint, long since gone stale. Broken helmets lined the shelves. A bent tackling dummy slumped in the corner like a collapsed figure, shadowed and still. The place was a graveyard of forgotten seasons. Rachel stepped inside. She'd waited until nightfall. The campus security cameras, if they even worked anymore, wouldn't catch her face under the hood of her coat. She'd parked 3 blocks away, walked through the back fence gap, the same one Jake used to squeeze through when he forgot his lanyard. Her flashlight flickered once, then steadied, casting a pale cone over dust-caked shelves and crumpled posters. Her boots made soft sounds on the concrete floor, muffled by years of settled dirt. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. And then, she saw it. The back wall beneath a rack of rotted practice jerseys, some still marked with fading number shad, been scratched over. Not with a pen, not paint, carved. Fingernails or metal, something desperate. She stepped closer, brushing aside a hanging jersey that crumbled at her touch. The words were uneven, jagged, etched into the plywood like someone had been racing time or fear. "Mom, I'm here." Rachel didn't breathe. Her knees gave out before the tears did, and she sank to the floor in a slow, disbelieving collapse. Her hands hovered over the words, not daring to touch them, afraid they might dissolve like a dream. Her son's handwriting. She knew it. The way he looped his M. The gap he always left between letters, like he couldn't quite trust them to stay together. Just beneath it, another carving. Cherie. His jersey number. Freshman year. The one they'd printed on a cake the week before tryouts. The one that never made it onto the field. She sat there for a long time in the dim, stale dark, the silence thick around her. Jake had been here. Not just passed through. Not just seen. He had been here. And he'd called for her the only way he could. The photo wasn't supposed to mean anything. It was a scanned image from a faculty archive part of a stack Glenn had requested from the district office under the guise of historical preservation for the school's football revival. A former assistant had taken it a week after Jake vanished, back when Coach Dean was reorganizing his office. Most of the pictures were Munden e-papers stacked on his desk, clipboards lined up, whiteboards with plays half erased. But one photo made Glenn stop cold. It was a wide shot of the coach's desk, drawers open, trophies shifted to one side. And hanging off the corner of the desk, barely visible but unmistakably real, was a scrap of red mesh torn, frayed, the kind used for practice jerseys. A rag, the caption said. Coach cleaning up old gear, using jersey bits to wipe down files. It wasn't the color that stopped Glenn. It was the number stenciled in black, half torn, half faded. You had to squint, adjust the contrast. But it was there. Cherie. Jake's number. He hadn't even made the final roster, but they'd issued jerseys ahead of time. The new ones, with bold block numbers and the Fairhaven crest on the back. Each freshman had been assigned one based on registration. Jake's was 11. Glenn remembered because the kid had been so proud of it, showed it off during lunch, held it up to his mom's phone camera after pickup. And now it was in a photo, draped over a corner of Coach Dean's desk like a shop towel. No explanation, no mention in the original search. Glenn stared at the image, bile rising in his throat. He took it to Rachel, showed her without speaking. Her fingers trembled as she held the photo under the lamp in her kitchen. She traced the number like she might coax it into changing. Her face didn't twist with grief this time. It hardened. That jersey was never returned, she whispered. The day he disappeared, I asked if they needed it back. They said no. Said the boys would wear them at the first scrimmage. She set the photo down gently. They never got to wear them. She turned her gaze to the window, to the darkness beyond. And Coach Dean was never supposed to have one. In the silence that followed, the truth began to settle like ash. Jake hadn't just vanished. He'd been dismantled, piece by piece. The man's name was Curtis Rowe. He'd been a janitor at Fairhaven High for almost 20 years before a stroke forced him into early retirement. Lived alone in a duplex on Sycamore Lane, with a radio that played too loud and a front porch covered in wind chimes. He didn't say much during the original investigation. Just stuck to his job, kept his head down. But people remember things differently with time. Curtis came forward on a Tuesday afternoon, showing up at the front desk of the Fairhaven Police Department with trembling hands and a crumpled envelope full of old pay stubs and work logs, like proof of his own credibility. Detective Hensley, now long promoted from patrol duty, took the statement herself. I didn't think it mattered back then, Curtis said, voice papery, eyes darting. No one asked me. I wasn't nobody. Still ain't. He was wrong. What he remembered mattered more than he knew. He said it was late past 11 p.m., the night Jake Morrow disappeared. He was finishing the floors in the east wing when he noticed the gym office light still on. At that hour, most of the building was dark, empty. Coach Dean usually left by 10 at the latest. I thought maybe he forgot something, Curtis said. Didn't think too much of it until I saw him out in the lot. He paused, mouth working around words he hadn't said aloud in years. He was loading up his trunk. Had a tarp or blanket. Something heavy. Trunk was dipped real low on one side like the shocks were bad. Did you see what was inside? Hensley asked. Curtis shook his head. "No, ma'am." He shut it fast when he saw me. Real fast. Didn't wave, didn't smile. Just drove off like a bat out of hell. And then he said the part that made everyone in the room sit a little straighter. He was wearing gloves. Latex ones. I thought he was cleaning or painting. But there was no paint smell. And I found 2 of them in the trash behind the gym the next morning. No one had followed up back then. No one had thought to ask a janitor working past midnight what he'd seen. They were too focused on the locker rooms, the cameras, the woods behind the field. But now, Rachel had the photo of Jake's jersey turned rag. Now, Glenn had a note written in blood that said, "Coach knows." And Curtis Rowe had just given them a time, a trunk, and a man who left the school in the dark car sagging under the weight of something no one wanted to see. The whistle had been sealed in an evidence bag for weeks. Glenn had stared at it more times than he could count. Tarnished metal, cracked plastic, still looped through a stiff leather lanyard. The kind of whistle handed out by every high school coach across the country. The kind that meant, run faster, line up again, shut your mouth. It had felt like noise, like a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, until now. He was at the evidence lab again, thumbing through files while the technician stepped out to take a call. Boredom led him back to the whistle. He turned it over in his hands, absently tracing the split down the casing, and that's when he saw it. At first it looked like a scratch. Faint, thin, buried under years of grime and fingerprint powder. But under the right light, angled just so, it caught the gleam of something intentional. Numbers, tiny, etched with something sharp and deliberate. Glenn held it closer, pulled out his phone. The numbers were familiar, not phone digits, not a date. Coordinates. He read them aloud under his breath, punching them into a Maps app with shaking fingers. The screen zoomed in. A patch of woods just outside town, near the old limestone quarry. He stared at the blinking red pin like it might bite. Glenn didn't call Anya Nino yet, not Rachel, not the police. He needed to see first, to know. By sunset, he was on the road, the whistle in his pocket, the coordinates burned into his memory. The trail to the quarry had once been marked, but years of overgrowth had taken it back. He parked on a gravel shoulder and walked the rest of the way, boots crunching through brittle leaves and twigs. The woods were quiet, too quiet, as if they remembered. When he reached the spot, his phone vibrated. GPS confirmed this was it. A clearing, ringed by trees, the quarry edge visible just beyond a small ridge. And in the center, a disturbed patch of soil, old, but not ancient, overgrown, but not forgotten. No marker, no stones. Just a place where something once was, and then wasn't. Glenn sank to his knees, clutching the whistle. It hadn't just been a cry for help. It had been a map. Jake had left them a way back, even if it took 12 years to read it. The bleachers loomed over them like an old skeleton, iron ribs casting long shadows in the flicker of Glenn's headlamp. The bolts creaked in the wind, whispering like voices that had been trapped for too long beneath the rusted seats. It was just past midnight. The school was dark, the town asleep. But Rachel Morrow was wide awake. She crouched in the dirt beside Glenn, hands wrapped in gardening gloves, breathing hard from nerves more than exertion. Glenn had brought the shovel. She'd brought Jake's cleats, just one of them, the one he'd left behind at the gate. The other had never been found. Until now, she hoped. The home team bleachers hadn't been touched in years, left to rot when the football program was shut down. But now, with all signs pointing to the field as something more than a stage for games, Rachel couldn't stop thinking about what Coach Dean had access to, where he could go unseen. The space beneath the stands was cramped, choked with weeds and splinters of discarded banners. Glenn began to dig, slow and deliberate, his movements careful. The soil was dry at first, but a few inches down, it turned damp, dark, rich, with secrets. "Here," Rachel said suddenly, pointing. "There's something. There's a gap." Glenn shifted the dirt with his hands, uncovering a shallow depression, like the earth had caved slightly from weight. He scraped back the loose soil, and then stopped. He reached in and pulled it free. A cleat. Jake's other cleat. The pair, torn at the toe, mud baked into the sole, faint streaks of red, long since dried. Rachel didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She held the shoe like something holy, her hands trembling as she ran her fingers over the frayed laces. And then the shovel struck something harder than dirt. A soft clink. Then another. Glenn's breath caught. He set the cleat down and knelt. He cleared the soil carefully, hands bare now. A small fragment emerged, white, curved. Then another, jagged and thin. Not stone, not plastic. Bone. Rachel leaned forward, her voice low, stunned. Is it? Glenn nodded, his face pale. It's human. They sat there in the hush beneath the bleachers, the metal groaning above them in the wind, the dirt cold and heavy between their knees. Jake had been here. Not gone, not vanished. Hidden. Buried just below the cheers and stomps of games that had gone on like nothing happened. But the field was remembering. And it was giving him back. The garage smelled like oil and rust and things that had been left too long under hoods. It was after hours when Glenn found him, Ryan R.J. Jameson, former Fairhaven quarterback and golden boy of the 2013 season, now crouched under a lifted Chevy, grease smeared across his jaw like war paint. He didn't look surprised to see Glenn. Just slid out from beneath the truck, wiped his hands on a rag that had probably been white once, and nodded toward a folding chair near the door. I figured you'd come, he said. His voice had dropped since high school, grown heavier, flatter. Everybody else is talking again. Guess it was only a matter of time. Glenn sat without speaking. RJ leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. The old football photos still hung on the wall him, mid-throw, cleats barely grazing the ground, Jake just behind him in the frame, blurred but visible. He liked cameras, RJ said after a long silence. Used to film drills on his phone. Routes, plays, whatever. Said it helped him get better. Glenn nodded slowly. You think he caught something? RJ didn't answer right away. He looked down at his boots, scuffed and oil-slicked, then back up with eyes that no longer held the easy confidence of youth. He did, he said finally. He showed me, that last week. Something behind the shed. I don't know what it was, not exactly, but it had Coach Dean and Maddox in it, and it was bad. How bad? RJ hesitated. Dean was yelling, grabbing someone. Might have been another kid. Maddox just stood there, not stopping it, watching like it was routine. Glenn felt the air leave his lungs. I told Jake to delete it. Said it wasn't our business. I was scared, man. That program ran everything. Dean could ruin your future with one phone call. RJ looked away. He said he'd turn it in anyway. Said people needed to know, and I told him to drop it, walk away, pretend it never happened. He rubbed his jaw, hard. The day he disappeared, I saw him by the bleachers. He looked nervous. Said he had something to do. Said if anything happened, I'd know why. Glenn stared at him. Did you tell anyone? RJ's voice cracked. I buried it, just like everyone else, but Jake didn't. He reached into a drawer, pulled out an old phone cracked, dead, but intact. I kept this, he said. Didn't open it. Couldn't. He handed it to Glenn. Maybe it's still in there. The truth, waiting beneath shattered glass. The phone arrived in a plastic evidence bag, its screen shattered like a spiderweb caught mid-spin. The casing was dented, the charging port warped, as if it had been stomped or thrown. But it was still intact, barely, and the hope that pulsed beneath its jagged glass was stronger than anything Glenn or Rachel dared say aloud. It took a week. The forensic techs at the state lab handled it like an artifact, prying it open with precision tools and prayers. Most of the hardware was unsalvageable. The battery was dead. The display wouldn't boot. But the SD card miraculously was intact. Rachel sat in the observation room the day they played the first file. No one said a word as the technician queued it up. Just a timestamp, September 3, 2013, 4:18 p.m., tryout day. The audio was rough, grainy. But the voices were there, tinny and warped around the edges, like echoes down a hallway. First came Jake's voices, soft, uncertain. "You said it wasn't going to be like last time. That he wouldn't be here." Then silence. Then another voice. Coach Dean's, unmistakable, even distorted. "Put the phone down, Jake." More silence. Shuffling. Breathing. Then Maddox's voice. Calm. Too calm. "You don't understand what you're doing." Jake again. Stronger this time. "I saw what you did behind the shed. You hurt him." More rustling. A sharp impact like the phone being knocked against something hard. "Delete it," Maddox snapped. "Now." "No," Jake said. His voice cracked, but it didn't break. "You can't scare me." Then came a pause. A long one. And when Dean spoke again, his voice had changed. Quieter, low, and tight. "You've got no idea what this'll mean for you, kid. For your family. You say one word, and everything you've got is gone." "I don't care," Jake said. "People need to know." And then it happened. A sharp yell, a thud, a metallic crash. A scream cut short. The file ended there. Rachel didn't cry. She sat still, hands folded in her lap, as if moving might cause the world to shatter again. Glenn stood beside her, unable to speak. It was the proof they'd never had. The moment everything changed, captured by a boy who refused to look away, even when everyone else did. Jake had spoken. And now finally, the world was listening. It was buried in a calendar entry-on that didn't exist on the school's official schedule, but lived instead in a backup from an old faculty inbox, the kind IT staff had forgotten was still archived. Glenn found it by accident while cross-referencing Coach Dean's emails from the week Jake disappeared. September 3, 2013, Extra Evil, JM, 5:30 p.m., Field Access Approved. 3 lines, no explanation, no distribution list, just initials and time. JM. Jake Morrow. Rachel sat across from him at Glenn's kitchen table, the lights dimmed low, the copy of the email printed and lying between them like a freshly exhumed bone. "They brought him back," she whispered. "After school. After everyone else had gone." The official story had always been that tryouts ended at 4, that Jake never finished warm-ups, that maybe he walked off the field and into the woods, disoriented, confused, or worse. That no one had seen him leave, because there was nothing to see. But now they had proof he'd been invited back. Privately. Unsupervised. Glenn dug deeper, pulled records, schedules, voicemails. Found a voice memo from the team parent group, a rushed recording from one mother, asking if the extra tryout was optional or just for that Morrow boy. Nobody responded. No other names on the list. No other players confirmed present. No attendance taken. The field lights had been turned on, manually recorded, as accessed at 5:34 p.m. and shut off again just after 7:00. And yet, no one reported seeing Jake at that time. No one, except one anonymous tip in the original file filed, dismissed, forgotten. A custodian had said he saw Coach Dean walking the field alone that night, pacing near the goalpost like he was looking for something. Now Glenn knew what it had been. "They planned it," Rachel said. "They made sure no one else would be there. Just him. Just Jake." Her voice didn't tremble. It burned. "He thought it was about the team," she said quietly. "He thought Coach wanted to give him another chance. And he went, alone, like a good player, like a good kid." She picked up the printout and folded it slowly, precisely, her knuckles white with pressure. "They didn't want him to try out." She stood, her chair scraping the floor behind her. "They wanted to make sure no one saw what happened when he did." The nursing home was quiet in the way only places filled with the dying could bestial, still, suspended in time. The halls smelled of bleach and warmed applesauce, and the walls were lined with faded posters meant to reassure but only made the place feel emptier. Rachel walked them, like she'd walked every corridor of Fairhaven High, after Jake vanished, relentless, silent, carrying something sharp just beneath her skin. She found him in room 203. Coach Everett Dean sat by the window, hunched over a tray of untouched food, the sunlight bleeding through yellowed blinds and casting long shadows across his legs. He looked smaller than she remembered, soft where once he had been square. His hands trembled as they hovered over a spoon. His whistle still hung around his neck. Rachel stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting the silence fill the space between them, letting him feel it. He looked up. His eyes were faded, rheumy, but the recognition was instant, and with it, the fear. "Rachel," he rasped, voice hollow. "I didn't expect—" "I don't care what you expected," she said, stepping inside. "She didn't sit. You lied. You brought him back that night. You planned it." He looked down at his hands, as though hoping the tray of applesauce might offer escape. "I didn't touch him," he said quickly, desperately. "It wasn't me. I told Maddox it was a mistake." "But you let it happen." His lip quivered. A muscle in his cheek twitched. "You buried him," Rachel whispered. "You let him be taken, and then you told us he walked away." Dean's hands gripped the armrests like he was holding onto the last edge of a cliff. "I tried to stop it," he said. "He said he wouldn't tell." Rachel stepped closer, her voice barely audible now. "Who?" Dean looked up at her with watery eyes. Something cracked open behind them. "Jake," he whispered. "He said he wouldn't tell if we let him go." Rachel froze. Her pulse thudded in her throat. "We." Dean's chest heaved. His face went pale. He reached for his water cup, missed, and the plastic clattered to the linoleum floor. "I didn't," he gasped, then blinked hard. "I didn't." He slumped sideways in his chair. The nurse arrived seconds later, called for help. Rachel backed away as orderlies rushed in, voices rising, machines beeping. She didn't move. She just stood in the doorway, watching the man who had lied about her son collapse beneath the weight of his own silence. The truth was breaking loose, and it wasn't done yet. The warrant was issued quietly, early on a Thursday morning, long before the town could catch wind of it. Glenn got the call just after dawn. Rachel was already awake when he arrived at her house, pacing the kitchen floor, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. "They're digging today," he said. "Maddox's old place. They think it's there." Rachel didn't ask what. She already knew. By midday, the street was blocked off, squad cars forming a loose perimeter around the dilapidated house that once belonged to Coach Leo Maddox. It had been empty for years, windows boarded, grass gone wild, the fence leaning like it had given up trying to stand straight, a house the neighbors tried to forget. But the backyard quiet, unremarkable, choked with weeds and dead leaf shad, never stopped keeping secrets. The forensic team moved quickly, careful and methodical. Ground-penetrating radar had picked up something dense beneath a patch of disturbed soil near the back fence. Glenn and Rachel watched from the other side of the street, standing behind the yellow tape, saying nothing. It didn't take long. 2 feet down, the shovels struck metal drum, rusted and sealed tight with bolts now fused by time. The techs surrounded it, eyes serious, voices clipped. Rachel held her breath. When they cracked the lid, a rush of odor hit the air damp, acrid, unnatural. The techs stepped back, covering their faces. Inside were bones. Wrapped in plastic, layered in cloth, decayed by years of stillness. The fragments were partial, delicate, but unmistakably human. They moved the remains piece by piece, each one lifted with gloved reverence, each placed into waiting evidence, containers like they were relics of a war no one had admitted was happening. Rachel didn't cry. Not until they pulled the final piece from the druma length of red mesh fabric, tangled and half-rotted, but still stitched with a faded number. Cherie. She turned away then, pressed her hands to her face as the sound left her throat quiet and broken and raw. Glenn reached for her, steadying her before she could fall. Jake hadn't just vanished. He hadn't run away. He hadn't wandered into the woods. He had been taken. Hidden. Buried. Right in the yard of the man they had trusted with their sons. And now the truth was rising, inch by inch, into the daylight. The call came just before midnight. Rachel was sitting on the couch, television off, House dark except for the lamp in the corner casting a soft yellow pool over the carpet. The only sound was the slow tick of the wall clock, a heartbeat she'd learned to live with. She answered the phone before the second ring. "Mrs. Morrow," said the voice on the other end. "Detective Hensley, gentle but steady. It's confirmed. The remains from the drum, the DNA, matched. It's Jake." Rachel didn't speak. She didn't have to. The silence said enough. "And there's more," Hensley continued. "We have the rest of the story." The cold truth unfolded in pieces, each one sharp enough to draw blood. Jake had stumbled onto something real. A history of coercion and abuse, buried under the pretense of discipline, masked by the illusion of mentorship. He had seen Maddox hurting another student behind the shed, had caught it on video, had threatened to report it. But the school had already paid to bury a similar accusation once. And Maddox, desperate not to be exposed again, had tried to convince Jake to stay quiet. Promised it would never happen again. Promised it was misunderstood. That he was misunderstood. Jake didn't believe him. He came back the next evening for the unscheduled practice, thinking he'd be heard, that someone, maybe even Coach Dean, would do the right thing. But Dean was already in too deep. He had seen the video, had listened to Maddox's side, weighed it against the life he'd built at that school, the reputation, the power, the control. He convinced himself Jake was overreacting, that he could fix it quietly. What happened on the field that night wasn't planned, not entirely. But when Jake refused to give up the phone, when he told them he was going to the police, something broke. Maddox lashed out. The blow came fast. Jake fell. He didn't get up. Dean panicked. Maddox did what he always did, took control. Said they'd make it disappear. Said no one had to know. So, they buried him. The bag, the bones, the number 11. Dean kept the whistle. Maddox fled. And Jake was left behind, in a barrel beneath the weeds, while the world moved on without him. Rachel hung up the phone. Then she stood, walked to Jake's room, opened the door, and turned on the light. He was still there, in every photo, every trophy, every book stacked on his desk. And now, so was the truth. Cold, heavy. But finally real. The arrest came on a cold morning in Wyoming, where the sky hung low and gray over the snow-dusted plains. Leo Maddox had been living under a different name, Leon Martin, registered as a youth counselor for a nonprofit tucked into the outskirts of Cheyenne. He was coaching again. Of course he was. When the officers surrounded his truck in the community center parking lot, he didn't run. He didn't even speak. Just raised his hands slowly, as if he already knew his freedom had been on borrowed time. The cuffs clicked closed, and the weight of 12 years finally began to settle on his shoulders. 2 weeks later, Everett Dean died in hospice care. The official cause was a stroke, but Rachel knew better. It wasn't his heart that failed. It was the truth that caught up with him. The moment his signature appeared on the rubber tap proving the cover-up, choosing silence over a boy's life, it had started ticking like a fuse inside him. It had just taken years to finish burning. When the press conference was scheduled, no one was sure if Rachel would speak. The town had watched her stand vigil over a memory for more than a decade, and now that the memory had a name, a place, and a body, they weren't sure what was left. But she came. The bleachers had been rebuilt, the field was resodded. And beside the north end zone, just beyond the chalk line, stood a new memorial stone pillar, etched with Jake's name, his jersey number, and a quote from one of his old essays. "Some people think small voices don't matter, but sometimes that's the only voice that tells the truth." Rachel stepped to the microphone, wind catching the edges of her coat. The crowd was silent: reporters, students, former teachers, families with hands clasped tight. Glenn stood just behind her, head bowed. "My son didn't die in war, or in an accident," she said. "He died because grown men made a choice to protect each other instead of protecting a child." He told the truth, and it cost him everything. She paused, looked toward the sky, then back at the field. "But Jake is not gone. He's here. In this place. In this grass. In every whistle blown in fairness. In every kid who learns that courage is doing the right thing, even when no one else will. The wind shifted, the flags rippled, and Fairhaven finally stood still, long enough to listen. The lights came on one by one, humming to life under the night sky, like stars staking their claim above the newly laid turf. Fairhaven hadn't seen a crowd like this in years. Parents, alumni, teachers, reporters, they packed the stands shoulder to shoulder, their breath fogging in the crisp autumn air. But it wasn't just for football. It was for Jake. The scoreboard bore no sponsors, no ads, just a simple dedication in gold letters backlit against the sky. The Morrow Field of Light. The name had been Rachel's idea, not because her son was gone, but because in the end, he had brought the darkness into view. He had been the light, small but unwavering, in a system built to keep certain truths hidden. Tonight, that light burned brighter than it ever had. The players lined up at midfield, not for kickoff, not yet, but for a moment of silence. Each wore a patch on their jersey. The number 11. No one had worn it since Jake. Rachel stood at the 50-yard line, her hair pinned back, wrapped in a navy scarf Jake had once used to dress as a superhero. In her hands, she held a small silver whistle. The same one they'd found in the duffel bag, now cleaned, restored, and silent until tonight. She looked out at the crowd, at Glenn beside her, at the rows of students too young to remember what happened here, but still shaped by it. "My son loved this game," she said into the mic, her voice steady but raw. "He came here to play it, and because he told the truth, he never got to." She took a breath, the whistle clutched in her hand. "Tonight, he does." Then she blew it. A long, clear note rang across the field, bright and piercing, the sound of beginning. The crowd erupted as the teams took their places. It wasn't about winning, not tonight. It was about presence, about remembrance, about reclaiming the space that had once swallowed a boy whole. As the players ran their first play, Rachel sat on the new bench at the edge of the field, her eyes never leaving the game. And when the quarterback threw a perfect pass into the end zone, a spiraling arc that cut through the dark and landed in the arms of number 11, stadium didn't cheer. It roared. Jake had come home. And this time, everyone saw him.